For over a century, one face has defined how the entire world pictures ancient Egypt. Smooth skin, a long, elegant neck, a crown that rises like a monument, and an expression so calm it feels almost otherworldly. This is the bust of Queen Nefertiti, and since the day it was pulled out of the sand, it has been treated less like an artifact and more like a religious icon. Tourists travel across continents just to stand in front of the glass case that holds her. Art historians call her the most beautiful face to survive from the ancient world. But in recent years, a piece of medical technology never designed for archaeology was pointed directly at her. And what it found underneath the paint has quietly rewritten the story of who this queen really was, and why she was carved the way she was. To understand why this discovery matters, you first have to understand what the bust actually is, and what it is not. It is not a mummy. It is not a death mask. It is a painted limestone sculpture, roughly 19 inches tall, created somewhere around 1345 BCE in the royal city of Amarna. It was found in 1912 by a team of German archaeologists digging through the remains of a sculptor's workshop, a man named Thutmose, whose name we only know because it was scratched onto a nearby ivory horse blinker. The bust had no inscription, no royal name, nothing to formally identify her. Scholars pieced together her identity from comparison, matching her features to carvings and reliefs elsewhere at Amarna that clearly named Nefertiti, the chief wife of the pharaoh Akhenaten. For decades, the assumption was simple. The bust was a finished portrait, perhaps a display piece, perhaps a gift, perhaps simply a beautiful object meant to honor the queen. Nobody thought to ask what was inside the stone, because nobody had a reason to. You don't X-ray a sculpture. You look at it. But in the early 2000s, and then again more thoroughly in 2009, teams of researchers working with the Berlin Museum that houses the bust decided to run it through a CT scanner. The same kind of machine hospitals used to look inside a human skull without cutting it open. The idea wasn't to search for a hidden secret. It was closer to routine conservation science, an attempt to understand how the piece had been constructed and whether it had ever been damaged or repaired. What they found instead turned out to be far more interesting than anyone expected. Underneath the painted plaster, the scanner revealed a second face carved directly into the limestone core. This interface was not identical to the one visible on the surface. According to the researchers who examined the scans, the stone underneath showed a woman with a less symmetrical structure, a slight bump visible on the bridge of the nose, softer and less sharply defined cheekbones, and creases near the corners of the mouth that don't appear at all on the outer plaster layer. In other words, the sculptor had shaped the raw limestone into a face with visible signs of age and individual imperfection, and had then applied layer after layer of plaster on top of it to smooth those features into the flawless, idealized image the world has been staring at for over 100 years. This is the detail that changed how many historians think about the bust. It isn't simply a portrait of Nefertiti. It's a portrait of two versions of Nefertiti at once, the woman as she likely looked, hidden a few millimeters beneath the surface, and the woman as the palace wanted her to be seen, sitting on top like a mask. Some Egyptologists have compared it to modern retouching, the ancient equivalent of smoothing a photograph before it's released to the public. Others go further, suggesting the plaster layer functioned almost like a diplomatic tool, a face built to be copied by other artists across the kingdom as the template for how the queen should officially appear in temples, on monuments, and in the households of Egyptian officials. To understand why anyone would go through that much trouble, you need to understand what kind of era Nefertiti was living through, because it was not a stable one. Her husband, Akhenaten, attempted one of the most radical religious transformations in the ancient world. For thousands of years, Egypt had worshipped a wide pantheon of gods, with immense temples, immense priesthoods, and immense political power concentrated in the hands of religious leaders. Akhenaten shut much of that down. He promoted the worship of a single deity, the Aten, represented as the sun disk, and he moved the capital away from the old religious centers to a newly built city in the middle of the desert, the very city, Amarna, where the bust was later found. This was not a popular decision. The priesthoods that lost their wealth and influence did not simply accept the change quietly. and ordinary Egyptians, whose entire spiritual lives had been built around the old gods, were being asked to abandon centuries of tradition almost overnight. In the middle of this upheaval, Nefertiti was not a passive figure standing beside her husband. Temple carvings from the period show her performing religious rituals typically reserved for kings. In several reliefs, she appears alone, without Akhenaten, shown in poses of authority that had rarely, if ever, been given to a queen before. Many historians now believe she held genuine religious and political power during this period, possibly functioning as a co-ruler in practice, even if not always in formal title. Given that context, the idea that her public image needed careful management starts to make a lot more sense. A queen who represents a controversial new religion, married to a pharaoh whose reforms were making enemies inside the palace and out, is not just a person. She is a symbol. And symbols, especially in a fragile political moment, tend to get polished until they are perfect. The bust, many researchers argue, wasn't created to capture how Nefertiti looked on an ordinary afternoon. It was created to be duplicated by other sculptors as an official reference, ensuring that no matter where in Egypt her image appeared, it always projected calm, youth, and divine authority. The real woman, lines and asymmetries and all, was sealed a few millimeters beneath that surface, visible only to a technology that wouldn't exist for another 3,000 years. There's a second layer to this discovery that adds even more weight to it, and it comes from a detail almost nobody discusses outside of specialist circles. The bust is missing something every other formal royal portrait from this era has. It has no inscription, no cartouche, no carved name identifying her. Nearly every statue, relief, or ceremonial object created for Egyptian royalty during this period carried an inscribed name, because in Egyptian belief, a name carried spiritual power. It was part of what tied a person's identity to their monument, and eventually to their place in the afterlife. The absence of a name on the most famous royal face in Egyptian history isn't necessarily sinister on its own. Some scholars believe the bust may simply have been an unfinished workshop model, rather than a completed dedication piece, which would explain both the missing inscription and the fact that it was found among the tools and materials of a working sculptor rather than in a temple or tomb. But combined with the discovery of the altered face underneath the plaster, it deepens the mystery of exactly what this object was for, and why so much care went into making sure the version the public saw was not the version actually carved in stone. It's worth pausing here to be honest about where solid science ends and speculation begins, because this is a case where the two get blurred constantly online. The CT scan findings themselves are well documented and were published through legitimate research collaborations with the museum that holds the bust. That part of the story is on firm ground. What is far less settled is everything people have tried to build on top of it. Over the years, all kinds of theories have circulated about Nefertiti's later life, that she ruled briefly as a female pharaoh under a different name after her husband's death, that her name was later chiseled off monuments during a political backlash, that her body may lie in an unidentified tomb in the Valley of the Kings, or even that it might rest behind a hidden chamber near the tomb of Tutankhamun. Some of these ideas come from respected Egyptologists and are backed by genuine archaeological evidence, like inscriptions that appear to have been altered. Others rest on far thinner evidence, including mummies whose identities remain unconfirmed and radar surveys of tomb walls that have produced contradictory results between different research teams. Responsible historians are careful to describe these as open questions, not solved mysteries, and it's worth treating them the same way rather than presenting every dramatic possibility as a proven fact. What nobody disputes, though, is the core discovery itself, that the most iconic face in ancient art is, quite literally, wearing a mask. Every photograph, every postcard, every museum poster of Nefertiti that has circulated for the last 100 years shows a face that was deliberately built on top of another one. The idealized queen the modern world fell in love with is a layer of plaster a few millimeters thick, applied over the actual features of a woman who lived through one of the most turbulent religious and political revolutions in Egyptian history. When you consider that this bust may have functioned as the master template other artists copied across the kingdom, the implications multiply. It means the entire visual identity of Nefertiti that Egyptians of her own era were shown, on temple walls, in household shrines, on ceremonial objects, was itself based on this same idealized, smoothed-over image, not the woman underneath it. In a very real sense, the propaganda worked so well that it fooled not just her own subjects 3,000 years ago, but archaeologists, art historians, and millions of museum visitors for the next century. There's something almost poetic in how this secret survived it all. The bust was never meant to be a finished, permanent monument sitting in a place of honor. It sat in a working sculptor's studio, likely as a reference piece. And when the city of Amarna was abandoned not long after Akhenaten's death, as Egypt's priesthoods reasserted control and much of his religious revolution was dismantled, the workshop was left behind and eventually buried under drifting desert sand. Because it carried no royal name, it was never targeted the way so many other monuments from this controversial era were, many of which had Akhenaten's and Nefertiti's names deliberately chiseled away by later rulers eager to erase the memory of the Aten religion. The bust survived precisely because it looked, on its surface, like nothing more than a beautiful, anonymous piece of art. It sat quietly for over 3,000 years until a German excavation team's shovel struck it in December of 1912, and it was carried out of the workshop rubble into a fame nobody building it could have imagined. So what does it actually mean that this hidden face has been found? It means the story people have been telling about Nefertiti for the last 100 years was never entirely true. She was not simply a serene, ageless beauty who existed to be admired. She was a real woman navigating a genuinely dangerous political and religious moment, a queen whose public image had to be constructed, managed, and idealized because the stability of a fragile new order depended on it. The CT scans didn't just reveal a technical detail about how ancient sculptors worked in layers of limestone and plaster. They revealed the gap between the person and the symbol, between the actual. Nefertiti and the palace needed the world to see. And in an odd way, that gap is what makes her more compelling now than she has ever been. For a century, people fell in love with a mask. Now we finally know there was someone underneath it. If there's a lesson buried in all of this, it might be about how easily image and reality can drift apart, even across 3,000 years, even with the most famous face in ancient history. The Nefertiti the world has celebrated in books, films, and museum halls was never a candid portrait. She was a carefully engineered symbol of stability during one of Egypt's most unstable chapters, sculpted specifically to be copied and distributed as an ideal. It took a hospital scanning machine, built to look inside living human bodies, to finally look inside a 3,000-year-old lie of stone and plaster, and to remind everyone that behind almost every polished, perfect image, there is usually a far more complicated and far more human truth waiting underneath.